There are rules in warfare that cannot be broken. One of them is this. When you are planning the largest river crossing operation in the history of the Second World War, you do not let someone else cross first. By March 1945, the Rhine River was the last significant natural barrier between the Allied armies and the heart of Germany. Every German commander worth his rank understood what the Rhine meant. It was not simply a river. It was the geographic expression of Germany's last realistic hope for prolonged resistance. Behind the Rhine, German forces could reorganize, re-equip, and present the Allies with a defensive problem that would cost months and thousands of lives to solve. In front of the Rhine, Germany was exposed. The Rhine is not a small river. At the points where the Allied armies would need to cross it in the spring of 1945, it runs between 300 and 500 meters wide. Its current is fast. Its banks are steep in places and flat in others, and the flat sections are the ones that defenders with artillery and machine guns prefer, because flat banks give the crossing force nowhere to hide. The Germans had spent months preparing the east bank of the Rhine as a defensive line, registering their artillery on every point where a crossing might be attempted, placing their remaining armor in positions where it could respond rapidly to any bridgehead that managed to establish itself. Crossing the Rhine against a prepared defense was, by every professional military assessment available to Allied planners in early 1945, one of the most dangerous operations the armies in the West would face. More dangerous than many of the battles that had preceded it, because a river crossing concentrates the attacking force in a narrow channel, exposes it to fire from 3 directions simultaneously, and requires the construction of bridging infrastructure under fire before the force on the far bank can be sustained at a strength sufficient to break out. Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery understood this better than anyone. He had been planning his Rhine crossing, Operation Plunder, since the autumn of 1944. It was to be the crowning achievement of his career, the largest set-piece river assault in the history of the war. 2 full armies, thousands of artillery pieces. An airborne operation, Operation Varsity, dropping 2 entire divisions behind the German lines simultaneously with the river crossing. Naval support, air support on a scale that would make D-Day look modest by comparison. Montgomery had briefed Churchill, he had briefed Eisenhower, he had briefed the press. Operation Plunder was scheduled for March 23, 1945. It was going to be the operation that broke Germany's back and ended the war in the West. There was one thing Montgomery had not planned for: George Patton. To understand what Patton did at the Rhine in March 1945, you need to understand what Patton had been doing for the previous 6 months and what that 6 months had cost him personally. He was 59 years old. He had commanded the Third Army since August 1st, 1944, and in the 7 months since that activation, his army had performed feats of operational speed and aggression that military historians would spend decades trying to fully explain. The race across France in August and September 1944, covering more than 81,000 square miles of territory by the end of the war, advancing at a pace that German commanders described in their after-action reports with something approaching disbelief. The relief of Bastogne in December 1944, turning an entire army 90 degrees in 48 hours, in winter conditions that military doctrine said made such a movement impossible. The drive through the Siegfried Line in February 1945, cracking defenses that had held against American attacks since September with the specific aggression that the Third Army had made its operational signature. By March 1945, the Third Army had taken somewhere between 140,000 and 200,000 prisoners, a figure that would grow substantially in the weeks ahead as the German military collapsed and had advanced further and faster than any American military formation in the history of warfare. Its casualties, while substantial, were proportionally lower than those of Allied formations that had fought more cautiously, because Patton's operational tempo kept the enemy off balance, kept him responding rather than planning, kept him moving backward rather than digging in. And through all of it, Patton had been fighting two wars simultaneously. The first war was against the Germans, which he was winning comprehensively. The second war was against Montgomery, which had been running since North Africa in 1943, and which had produced some of the most documented and colorful inter-Allied friction of the entire conflict. The rivalry between Patton and Montgomery was not simply personal, though it was intensely personal. It was strategic. The two men represented fundamentally different approaches to warfare. Montgomery's set-piece, methodical, overwhelming force approach versus Patton's improvised, aggressive, speed-above-all approach. And those approaches competed for the same resources throughout the Northwest Europe campaign. The roots of the rivalry ran deep. In Sicily, in 1943, Patton had raced Montgomery to Messina and beaten him, arriving in the city first after a campaign in which the two armies had competed as much as cooperated. Montgomery had never forgiven it. Patton had never forgotten it. When Eisenhower's broad front strategy had prioritized Montgomery's Market Garden operation in September 1944, the ambitious airborne assault into the Netherlands that ended in failure at Arnhem, Patton's tanks had run out of fuel 50 miles from the German border. He had been stopped not by German resistance, but by a logistical decision that rerouted fuel from his army to Montgomery's operation. He believed, with the specific conviction of a man who had watched the alternative unfold from the front seat, that if his army had been given the fuel that went to Market Garden, the war in Europe would have ended in 1944. He could not prove this. He believed it with complete conviction. In the winter of 1944 and into early 1945, as Montgomery assembled the forces and resources for Operation Plunder with the methodical thoroughness that defined his generalship, Patton watched from his sector to the south with the specific impatience of a man who understands that history is being written and who intends to write a chapter of it before someone else does. Montgomery's Operation Plunder was scheduled for March 23rd. It would involve the British Second Army and the American Ninth Army, which had been placed under Montgomery's command, a command arrangement that Patton considered an insult to American military professionalism and recorded in his diary with language that his editors sanitized in the post-war publication. Patton's Third Army was operating to the south of Montgomery's sector. His mission in early March 1945 was to clear the west bank of the Rhine in his zone and prepare for an eventual crossing. The operational sequence, as Eisenhower had designed it, was clear. Montgomery crosses first, establishes the main Allied bridgehead, then the other armies exploit the opening. Patton was expected to wait. He had no intention of waiting. In the first 3 weeks of March 1945, as Montgomery's staff finalized the last details of Operation Plunder and the logistics of moving 2 armies' worth of bridging equipment to the Rhine, Patton drove his corps commanders with instructions that his after-action reports document with clinical precision. Move faster. The river is the objective. Get there. His engineers were already preparing bridging equipment. His logistics staff was positioning fuel and ammunition forward. His intelligence officers were identifying crossing points in his sector, places where the river narrowed, where the current was manageable, where the east bank terrain gave a crossing force somewhere to go once it was across. He was not planning. He was preparing. There is a difference in Patton's operational vocabulary between planning and preparing. Planning implies deliberation, staff work, coordination, approval from higher headquarters. Preparing implies action already in motion, options already loaded, the capacity to execute at the moment opportunity presents itself. By March 20th, 1945, the Third Army was prepared. March 7th, 1945, the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen. Elements of the American 9th Armored Division, advancing in the adjacent 1st Army sector north of Patton's zone, find the Ludendorff Railroad Bridge over the Rhine still standing. The Germans have failed to destroy it. American soldiers are across the Rhine within hours. The capture of a standing Rhine bridge by an attacking army was unprecedented in modern military history, and the speed with which American forces exploited the opportunity reflected exactly the kind of aggressive opportunism that Eisenhower's armies had been developing since Normandy. Eisenhower immediately understands the strategic significance and authorizes exploitation of the bridgehead. The news races through Allied headquarters. In Montgomery's headquarters, the reaction is documented in the accounts of British officers who were present. The Field Marshal, who has been planning the definitive Rhine crossing for months, learns that Americans are already across the river at a bridge nobody planned to use, in a sector that was not supposed to be the main effort, on a day when Operation Plunder is still 2 weeks away. Montgomery's public response is professionally controlled. His private response is captured in the accounts of those around him. Patton hears the news and understands immediately what it means strategically and what it means for the race that has been running between himself and Montgomery since Africa. The bridgehead at Remagen is in the First Army's sector, not his. He cannot exploit it directly. But what Remagen tells him is operationally significant beyond its own location. If the Germans have failed to destroy the Ludendorff Bridge, if their defensive preparations on the Rhine are incomplete at Remagen, then the defensive preparations elsewhere on the river may be equally incomplete. The Rhine is not an equally defended line from end to end. There are weak points. His job is to find one. His engineers are already looking. The point they identify is at Oppenheim, south of Mainz, in the Third Army's sector. The river at Oppenheim is wide, approximately 350 meters, but the current is manageable, and the east bank terrain, while not ideal, gives a crossing force room to maneuver. The German defenses at Oppenheim are present but not concentrated. The 352nd Volksgrenadier Division holds the east bank in this sector, but it is under strength, under-equipped, and oriented toward the threat from the north, where it knows the big British crossing is coming. Nobody in German planning is expecting a crossing at Oppenheim. It is not a natural crossing point. It is not where the bridges are. It is not where the Allies have been concentrating their visible bridging equipment. It is exactly where Patton wants to cross. He gives the order on March 22nd, 1945. The 5th Infantry Division, commanded by Major General S. Leroy Irwin, prepares for the crossing. The engineers bring the assault boats forward after dark. The operation is conducted with a secrecy that is, by Third Army standards, almost uncharacteristic. Patton wants to be across before anyone, German or Allied, understands what is happening. At 22:30 hours on March 22nd, 1945, the first assault boats of the 5th Infantry Division push off from the west bank of the Rhine at Oppenheim. The river is dark. The current pulls at the boats. The engineers paddle hard. The men of the first wave, infantry soldiers who have fought from Normandy through France, through the Siegfried Line, to this bank of this river, are silent in the boats, weapons ready, watching the east bank grow larger in the darkness. The German defenders at Oppenheim are not ready. The first Americans reach the east bank of the Rhine and establish a foothold before the German defenders understand what is happening. There is fire, scattered, disorganized, the fire of defenders who have been surprised rather than the prepared fire of defenders who have been waiting. The Americans move off the riverbank and push inland, creating the space that the engineers need to bring the next wave across. Wave follows wave through the night. By dawn on March 23rd, the 5th Infantry Division has a bridgehead on the east bank of the Rhine. Engineers are already beginning work on a pontoon bridge. The bridgehead is expanding. The casualties for the initial crossing are documented in the 3rd Army after-action reports. 8 men killed. The wounded figure varies across different after-action reports. The total casualty count, including killed and wounded, is documented at approximately 34, meaning roughly 26 men wounded alongside the 8 killed. For a Rhine crossing, let that number sit for a moment. 8 men killed crossing the Rhine River against a prepared German defensive line, in a river 350 meters wide, in the dark, without artillery preparation, without airborne support, without the massive logistical build-up that Montgomery has spent 6 months assembling for his crossing 40 miles to the north. 8 men. Patton calls Bradley at 8 o'clock on March 23rd. The conversation is documented in Bradley's post-war memoir with the specific detail of a man who understood exactly what his subordinate had just accomplished. "Brad," Patton tells him, "don't tell anyone, but I'm across." Bradley asks him to explain. Patton tells him the 3rd Army crossed the Rhine last night. He tells him he wants to hold the announcement until his bridgehead is more secure. He does not want the Germans to concentrate reserves against Oppenheim before his engineers have the pontoon bridge operational. Bradley, by his own account, laughs. The pontoon bridge at Oppenheim is operational by the afternoon of March 23rd. 3rd Army vehicles begin crossing, tanks, artillery, trucks, the entire logistics tale of a field army moving from one bank of the Rhine to the other in the hours before Montgomery's Operation Plunder has even begun. Patton crosses his own bridge. He walks out onto the pontoon bridge at Oppenheim in the afternoon of March the 23rd, 1945. Around him, his army is flowing east. The sound of engines, the weight of vehicles on the floating bridge, the Rhine, moving dark and fast beneath the pontoons. He reaches the middle of the bridge. He stops. He looks at the river beneath him. He looks east, toward Germany, toward the war that is now effectively won for any commander willing to read the situation honestly. He unzips his uniform. He urinates into the Rhine. The moment is photographed. It is documented in the accounts of multiple officers who were present on that bridge. It is recorded in Patton's own diary with the satisfaction of a man who has been waiting for this moment for years and intends to enjoy it without reservation. The photograph exists. The diary entry exists. The accounts of officers present on that bridge exist. What Patton did on the middle of the pontoon bridge at Oppenheim on the afternoon of March 23rd, 1945, is one of the most documented personal moments of the entire Western Front campaign. He later tells his staff that he has wanted to do this since he was a boy, reading about Caesar crossing rivers. He tells them that he had also planned to do it at the Siegfried Line, but the opportunity had not presented itself correctly. His aide, Chester Hansen, records his exact words in his diary that day. "I drove to the river and walked across on the pontoon bridge. I stopped in the middle and took a piss in the Rhine. I have been looking forward to this for a long time." The words are his. The moment is documented. The war is effectively over. Meanwhile, 40 miles to the north, Montgomery is finalizing the preparations for Operation Plunder. Everything in this video is documented. Real names, real dates, real words spoken by real people in extraordinary moments. That documentation exists. But without someone telling the story, it dies in an archive. Your subscription keeps that from happening. Hit like and subscribe right now. There are hundreds more stories exactly like this one sitting in those archives. We find them. That is all we do. Operation Plunder launches on the night of March 23rd with everything Montgomery has assembled. The artillery preparation begins at 2100 hours, more than 3,500 guns firing across a front of 25 miles, the largest artillery concentration in British military history. The sound of it is documented in the accounts of soldiers on both banks of the Rhine as something beyond anything they had experienced in years of combat. A continuous physical pressure in the air, a rolling concussion that could be felt miles from the guns. The assault crossing begins at 2100 hours as well, with the British 51st Highland Division and the Canadian 3rd Infantry Division leading. The airborne operation, Operation Varsity, launches at 10 o'clock on March 24th, dropping the British 6th Airborne Division and the American 17th Airborne Division behind the German lines in the largest single-day airborne operation in history. It is a magnificent military operation. It is executed with the thoroughness and professionalism that defines everything Montgomery does at his best. Its casualties are substantial. The airborne operation alone costs more than 2,000 Allied soldiers killed, wounded, and missing. But the bridgehead it establishes is deep and secure. Winston Churchill watches from the West Bank. He has come personally to witness what Montgomery has been building toward for 6 months. The photographs of Churchill at the Rhine crossing are some of the most widely reproduced images of the final year of the war. He is watching a crossing that Patton completed the previous night. The German reaction to the Oppenheim crossing is documented in the war diary of German Army Group B. Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding the German forces in the path of the Allied advance, receives the reports from Oppenheim on the morning of March 23rd with the specific alarm of a commander who has been oriented toward the anticipated British crossing to the north and has just been told that Americans are already on the east bank of the Rhine in his southern sector. His situation reports describe the Oppenheim bridgehead with the flat urgency of professional military language that cannot conceal the operational crisis it represents. The Americans are across. The bridge is being reinforced. The forces available to contain the bridgehead are insufficient. The reserves that might have sealed it are committed against the anticipated main effort to the north. He requests permission to withdraw east of the Rhine, across his entire front. The request is denied. Hitler orders the Rhine held everywhere. The order is impossible to execute. The Americans are already on the wrong side of it. The British are crossing in force to the north. The Remagen bridgehead has been expanding for 2 weeks. German Army Group B is not facing a river defense problem anymore. It is facing an encirclement. It does not yet know this fully, but the shape of what is coming is visible in the situation reports of March 23rd and 24th to anyone reading them honestly. Model reads them honestly. Patton, on the east bank of the Rhine, is already planning his next move. The strategic consequences of what Patton did at Oppenheim on the night of March 22nd extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. The Third Army's crossing at Oppenheim, combined with the Remagen bridgehead to the north and Montgomery's Operation Plunder, confronted German Army Group B with what its commander, Field Marshal Model, correctly identified as a strategically insoluble situation. 3 Allied crossings of the Rhine in 48 hours, across a front too wide for available German reserves to contest simultaneously, advancing into the Ruhr, the industrial heartland of what remained of German war production. The Ruhr industrial region produced coal, steel, and armaments that the German war economy could not replace if it lost access to them. It had been bombed extensively by Allied strategic air power since 1943, but it was still functioning at a level that German military production depended on. If the Ruhr was encircled, if Allied forces east of the Rhine could link up and cut off the German forces defending it, the military-industrial capacity of the German state would effectively cease to exist. The encirclement of the Ruhr pocket was complete by April 1st, 1945. More than 300,000 German soldiers were trapped inside, the largest encirclement of German forces on the Western Front of the entire war. More German soldiers were trapped in the Ruhr than had been trapped at Stalingrad. Model was among them. He had held his command together through impossible circumstances since the summer of 1944, retreating from Normandy, stabilizing the front after Market Garden, managing the Ardennes offensive, and now facing the final encirclement with forces that had no realistic prospect of breaking out. He refused to surrender. He issued orders dissolving his command on April 15th and releasing his soldiers from their oaths of service. He then walked into a forest near Duisburg. His body was found the following day. He had shot himself. He was 54 years old. The war in the West effectively ended in the Ruhr pocket. Not formally, the formal surrender came on May 8, 1945, but strategically. The German military capacity to contest the Allied advance in any organized sense ceased to exist as a coherent force when the Ruhr was encircled. Patton drove east, his Third Army, across the Rhine and moving through central Germany at the operational tempo that had defined it since Normandy, advanced toward Czechoslovakia and Austria. By the time Germany surrendered, the Third Army had reached Pilsen in Czechoslovakia and was positioned to drive to Prague, a drive that Patton believed, with the same conviction he had brought to every operational argument of the war, should be allowed to proceed. Eisenhower ordered him to halt at Pilsen. The decision was political. The Soviet Union had been promised Prague as part of the post-war occupation arrangements, and Patton considered it, by the documented accounts of those around him, one of the great strategic errors of the post-war settlement. He halted. He did not accept the order gracefully. He accepted it. That was the final act of Patton's war. Not the Rhine crossing, not the urination that had become one of the most famous images of the campaign. The halt at Pilsen, 50 miles from Prague, on orders that he believed were wrong and that he obeyed because he was a soldier, and soldiers obey orders even when they believe the orders are mistaken. Montgomery's Operation Plunder was executed successfully and contributed substantially to the final Allied advance into Germany. It is studied in military academies as a model of set-piece river assault planning. The thoroughness of its preparation, the scale of its execution, and the professionalism with which it was conducted represent Montgomery at his operational best. It crossed a river that Patton had crossed the night before, in rubber boats, at a cost of 8 men killed. George Patton stood on the pontoon bridge at Oppenheim on the afternoon of March 23, 1945, looked at the Rhine moving beneath him, and did something that no regulation required and no order authorized. He was 59 years old. He had been at war continuously since 1943. He had fought from the beaches of North Africa to this bridge in the middle of Germany's last river barrier. He had survived the slapping incident, the fuel crisis, the Battle of the Bulge, and years of a rivalry with the most celebrated British general of the war. He had crossed the Rhine before Montgomery. He savored it in the specific way that George Patton savored things, completely, unapologetically, and with the full knowledge that what he had done would be recorded and remembered. His diary entry from March 23, 1945, is one of the most quoted passages in the extensive literature surrounding his career. The satisfaction in it is undisguised and complete. He does not attempt to present it as a pure operational achievement divorced from its personal dimensions. He presents it as both, the operational achievement and the personal victory, inseparable in his mind and in the historical record. Omar Bradley, who received Patton's phone call on the morning of March 23rd and who laughed when he understood what his subordinate had done, wrote about the moment in his post-war memoir with the warmth of a man recalling one of the genuinely great days of a long career. He had told Patton not to tell anyone. Patton had called Eisenhower within hours. Eisenhower, in his communications and his private conversations documented by those around him, processed Patton's Rhine crossing with the specific mixture of exasperation and admiration that characterized his entire relationship with his most difficult subordinate. Exasperated because Patton had once again acted unilaterally in a way that complicated coalition management. Admiring because Patton had once again been right, and the results were undeniable. The Third Army crossed the Rhine at Oppenheim with 8 men killed. That number stands in the historical record as the specific expression of what Patton's approach to warfare achieved when it worked perfectly. The exploitation of surprise, of speed, of the enemy's unpreparedness to achieve in hours and at minimum cost what a more methodical approach would have taken weeks and thousands of casualties to accomplish. 8 men, the men of the 5th Infantry Division, who paddled across the Rhine in rubber boats on the night of March 22, 1945, came from towns and cities across America. They had been in the war since North Africa, or Sicily, or Normandy. They had fought through France and Belgium and Germany to the bank of that river. They crossed it in the dark without knowing that what they were doing would be remembered as one of the most audacious operational moments of the entire Western Front campaign. They crossed it because Patton told them to. They crossed it because Patton had looked at the river and the calendar and Montgomery's carefully arranged press coverage and decided that waiting was not something the Third Army did. The Rhine still flows through Oppenheim. The pontoon bridge is gone. It was a military installation, not a permanent structure, and it was removed when the army no longer needed it. The river at that point looks much as it looked on the night of March 22, 1945, wide and dark and fast, the kind of river that serious military professionals plan for months before attempting to cross. Patton crossed it in an afternoon. If this story is still in your head right now, if you're still thinking about it, that like button is the right response. Hit it. This channel is built on the belief that the stories nobody tells are often the most important ones. If you share that belief, subscribe. We'll keep finding them. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country below. And if this story connects to your family's history, any family, any nation, tell us. These moments belong to everyone. Thank you for giving General Patton and the men of the 5th Infantry Division the echo they deserved. They crossed the Rhine before anyone said it was their turn. You made sure it carried.